Friends, this morning we are continuing our sermon series called Unafraid. And this series is based on the book by Reverend Adam Hamilton of the same name. We started this series last week looking at how we are living in an age of anxiety. And if you happen to miss that sermon and wanted to catch up, we have it available on our YouTube channel, which you can get to through our website. We also should have a version out on Facebook because we record it during our praise service on Facebook Live. And so if you'd like to catch up on that's one way that you can do that. We also encouraged folks to get the book and to follow along in the series. And so in your bulletin, in the announcements insert, are the sermons in this series and the chapters in the book that we're referring to in that particular sermon. So take a look at that and you can follow along as well. So this morning we are looking at fear of the other. And in addition to the scripture that Melanie read for us from Matthew 5, I am reading from the epistle called 1 John 4. And I'm starting in the second half of the 16th verse. God is love. And those who remain in love remain in God, and God remains in them. This is how love has been perfected in us, so that we can have confidence on the judgment day, because we are exactly the same as God is in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear expects punishment. The person who is afraid has not been made perfect in love. We love because God first loved us. If anyone says, I love God, and hates a brother or sister, he is a liar. Because the person who doesn't love a brother or sister who can be seen, can't love God, who can't be seen. This commandment we have from him: those who claim to love God ought to love their brother and sister also. May God add wisdom to the reading, hearing, and understanding of these words. Where were you on September 11th, 2001? I was in Southern California visiting my parents. I had flown there the day before because my mom had had surgery, and I offered to come and help her out during her recovery. And that morning, the morning of September 11th, I was driving to a local gym in order to get in an early morning workout. When I arrived at the gym about 5 minutes before they actually opened up the doors, there were several women outside of the gym who were talking about a plane flying into one of the World Trade Center towers in New York. And as I listened to their conversation, I thought to myself, what in the world are they smoking? Because what they were saying about planes flying into the World Trade Center made no sense to me. And since it made no sense in my mind, it just couldn't be true. Well, when I finally got inside, I jumped on one of the treadmills and they turned on the TVs, and sure enough, there it was, pictures of the smoldering tower. I was stunned. And as I walked on that treadmill and I watched those TVs, all of a sudden a huge ball of fire came shooting out of the second tower. Now, I did not have headphones in, so I couldn't hear the commentary. All I could see was the pictures. But it was at that moment that I realized that the other tower had also been hit by a plane. That's when I decided I needed to cut my workout short, because I needed to get home and find out if my parents were watching it too. See if they knew that our country was under attack. Well, they were still asleep, so of course I woke them up. And we turned on the TV just in time to hear that another plane had crashed into the Pentagon. And we watched in disbelief as the South Tower collapsed upon itself. And then we heard of a fourth plane crashing in a field in Pennsylvania. And then the North Tower came crashing down. And I remember thinking to myself, this has got to be a nightmare. This just can't be real. But it was real. And the nightmare was just beginning. After that fateful day, it didn't take long for us to find out who the hijackers were, nor did it take long for our collective fear to take hold as a country. Nearly half of those who were surveyed shortly after the attacks reported that their sense of safety and security had been shaken by what happened on September 11th. And 62% reported that they experienced difficulty sleeping. In the weeks that followed, there was a surge of incidents, harassments, and hate crimes that occurred against people who looked like they were Middle Eastern or Muslim, the other. One such incident took place right here in Mesa, Arizona, just 4 days after the attacks on September 15th. Babir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh American who wore a beard and a turban, was murdered by Frank Roque, an aircraft mechanic who thought that Mr. Sodhi, who was a Sikh, was an Arab Muslim, the other. His was the first in a series of hate crimes and murders that was born out of fear of the other. Now, many of us point to the attacks on September 11th as a tipping point in this country that has led us to fear the other. But the truth is that for hundreds of years, this country has been wrapped up in that kind of fear. When the colonists from Europe and Britain arrived in this country in order to create what they would call a Christian nation, their fear of the native people made them behave in ways that were less than Christ-like. Many of the native people were killed in mass genocide, and those that weren't were relocated to reservations, forced to live in specific places. And their children were taken away from their homes and forced to attend special Indian boarding schools. One was here right in Phoenix. And there they were taught to become more like the Europeans. And when African slaves were granted their freedom, they and their descendants were still mistreated. And sadly, they still are. And in the 1940s, during World War II, after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who famously declared that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, issued an executive order that required Japanese Americans to be forcibly detained and sent to internment camps in certain places in this country because they were thought to be spies, all out of fear for the other. In Psalm 27, the psalmist asked the question, "Whom shall I fear?" Well, let me tell you, today we're afraid of people from different countries, people who are of a different race or ethnicity than ourselves, or who belong to a different religion. We're afraid of immigrants and people with different skin color. If we're straight, we're afraid of people who are gay. If we're gay, we're afraid of people who are straight. Women fear men, men fear women, children fear adults, and the elderly fear their caregivers. And all of us are afraid of people who abuse us or who approach us with a weapon, maybe rightly so. And all of this fear creates a condition of distrust. It makes us separate ourselves from each other and can lead to oppression and exclusion. In short, it leads us to a state of xenophobia, which Bishop William Willimon, one of our United Methodist bishops, describes in his book called Fear of the Other like this. He writes, "Xenophobic, exclusionary fear of the other is more than a matter of preference for people whom we enjoy hanging out with or those with whom we feel most comfortable. In deep fear of the other, we separate ourselves from others in order to better oppress, exploit, expulse, confine, hurt, or deny justice and access to others whom we have judged to be the other, as to be beyond the bounds of having any bond between us or any claim upon us. In other words, when we live with the underlying fear of people who are different from us, our actions are typically less than Christ-like. Our response to our fear almost always leads us to do the wrong thing, often at the expense of another child of God. Last Sunday, we learned that fear is actually a great gift from God. That it helps to keep us safe by acting as our early warning system when danger is near. Thanks to millions of years of evolution and social conditioning, when our brains perceive a threat, it sends neurological messages to other parts of our bodies and prepares us for fight or flight. But sometimes our brains are wrong. They're wrong about the threat. Sometimes our brains perceive a threat that isn't really there. And when that happens, especially when the threat we perceive has to do with another person, our early warning system may cause us to react in ways that are less than admirable. According to David Rock, author of Your Brain at Work, research shows that when we experience a threat, we tend to think less clearly. We have difficulty receiving and assimilating new information. We make mistakes in perception and interpretation, coming to false conclusions. And we tend to respond negatively to situations. Now, all of this can cause us to make terrible mistakes and to reach a false conclusion about the other. Let's take a look at a real-life example of this. In March of 2016, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager's personal emails were hacked, and they were made public the following October. Now, according to some, those emails contained coded messages that allegedly linked several high-ranking officials, including Secretary Clinton, to a human trafficking ring that was also abusing children. Now, that story, which was eventually debunked, was originally posted on websites known to be hotbeds for fake news. But then those stories were picked up by the mainstream media, and they spread through social media platforms, and they spread like wildfire. According to the story, this ring was operating out of several restaurants, including one called Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria in Washington, D.C. Soon, Comet Ping Pong's owners and staff started receiving death threats. Even some of the bands that performed there were harassed on social media and in person. And on December 4th of 2016, Edgar Madison Welch, a 28-year-old husband and father of two, from North Carolina, walked into Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria with an AR-15 style rifle and started shooting at the ceiling. He told authorities later on that he was there to save the children. Thankfully, no one was hurt in his rampage. But his fear of the other, those he believed were committing horrible, horrible crimes against children, led him to respond just as David Rock suggested. He was unable to think clearly. He was unable to receive more accurate information, which made him to make mistakes in judgment and led to false conclusions, and ultimately resulted in his negative and illegal response, all out of fear of the other. So, how should we then deal with our fears of other people? First, we must remember once again that fear in itself is not a bad thing. There are going to be times when our fears of the other are warranted, and our response to that fear can keep us safe. But when our fear of the other is unwarranted, when it makes us react in ways that are less than admirable and makes us react in ways that are not like Christ, that's when we need to reframe our fear. Last Sunday, I shared with you that one way to deal with fear is to face it, to name it, to write it down, to keep it in the forefront, and then educate yourself about your fear, visualize yourself overcoming your fear, all while trusting in God's presence. In short, facing our fears with faith. But another way that we can deal with our fear, especially our fear of the other, is to examine our assumptions in light of the facts. Why is that important? Because often when it comes to our fear of the other, our assumptions don't line up with reality. For example, in his book, Unafraid, Adam Hamilton notes that Americans routinely report being afraid of those who commit violent crimes. We talked about this last Sunday. And I shared with you last Sunday that violent crime has declined as much as 40% since its peak in 1993. But Adam further notes that every year in this country about 15,000 murders take place, which by itself is a frightening statistic. But, he goes on, more than 251,000 people die every year because of medical or pharmaceutical errors. 15,000 by murder, 251,000 by error. We are also twice as likely to die in a car accident than we are to be killed by a person. And for every person who dies from a violent crime, 40 will die of heart disease. And last time I checked, heart disease was not on our top 10 list of fears. So we need to examine our assumptions based on the facts rather than our feelings. And that will then help us realize indeed that maybe we do have nothing to fear but fear itself. But just in case that's not enough, we might consider using a technique called cognitive restructuring. Now, this is a technique that is used by behavioral health professionals, and it can be used to help us deal with our preconceived notions that can lead us to fear. Now, once again, I need to issue my disclaimer. If you have a fear, and depending upon your level of anxiety, you may need professional help. And I urge you to get it from someone who is much more qualified than I am to offer it. But if you're willing to give some of these techniques a try on your own, here's a little bit about how this cognitive restructuring might work. The first thing you should do is relax. Now, I know that's easier said than done, right? But there are ways you can do it. There are some relaxation strategies that you can use, things like deep breathing or progressive muscle relaxation, where you systematically tense and then relax certain muscles in your body. You can also try listening to calming music, or try meditation or yoga or massage, which, by the way, I highly recommend. I got one last week. Whew. Next, after we are all relaxed, we need to replace unrealistic thoughts with realistic and balanced thinking that is informed by data and facts. This not only involves paying attention to your thoughts, but it also requires replacing past assumptions with better, more accurate information. In other words, you all need to do your homework and look for the facts. And then last, and perhaps this is the most important step of all, is to face your fears through a process called exposure. What this entails is gradually and repeatedly putting yourself in situations that cause you to fear until you no longer feel that fear. And you can overcome your fear and your preconceived notions, particularly as they pertain to the other. And let's not forget that as people of faith, we can and should turn to the scriptures for help. Just like the one from 1 John 4 that I just read a few moments ago. There we hear, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. When we face our fear of the other with love, we can let go of that fear and turn it over to God. My first appointment as a United Methodist pastor was at a church in the West Valley of Phoenix called Faith United Methodist Church. On my first day there, I was told about a homeless man named Tony. You see, Tony had decided long before I became pastor there that the church was his house and that the classrooms were his bedrooms. And he regularly broke into the church in order to get into the classrooms so he could sleep at night. I was told by a number of people at the church there that I should stay away from Tony. After all, he was big and kind of, to them, scary looking, and he was homeless, which was the big thing, and to them, he was dangerous. That meant that he was dangerous. He was someone that I should be afraid of. Now, I must confess that up until that point, dealing with people who were homeless made me uncomfortable. It wasn't one of my warm, fuzzy places. For me, they were the other. They were people that I was programmed to be afraid of. Well, not long after I had been told about Tony, I arrived at the church one morning and my assistant told me that Tony was there, that he had broken into one of the classrooms and was asleep on the floor. My assistant then told me, because he was also afraid of Tony, that he had already called the police. But I decided that even though I too was afraid of Tony, I had to face him and my fear. Now, I didn't do it gradually like I just told you ought to do. No, I just jumped in with both feet. I went straight to that room where Tony was sleeping, and I woke him up. I told him who I was. I said, "Hi, I'm the new pastor." Now, he tried to tell me that the pastor before me had told him that it was okay for him to sleep in the rooms. And I told him, "Yeah, right." I admonished him for breaking into the church. And as we were talking about that, the police arrived and took Tony away. But he came back again and again and again. And after a while, guess what? Tony and I became friends. Now, we still argued about the fact that the church was not his house and that he needed to stop breaking into the classrooms. But we also had some really good conversations. And you know what else happened? Because of my relationship with Tony, I was able to better relate to other people who were homeless, who came to the church or who were out in the community. I was able to reframe my fear. And Tony gave me the courage to face that fear and to face other folks who were homeless. Facing my fear and reframing it helped me to be a better pastor to the homeless people in that community. And I was able to be more compassionate toward them. I was able to love them and to see Jesus in their faces. Remember what Jesus said about, "Whenever you do it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you do it to me"? Tony helped me to overcome my fear of the other and to replace it with love for the other. And we read about that in 1 John chapter 4. There is no fear in love, because perfect love drives out fear. Amen.